which is the subsidiary bodies meeting that sets the crucial groundwork for the year's most important climate summit, which you should know as the COP. So as you might all know, the COP30, yes, it's been happening for 30 years already, is happening in Brazil this year. And while the November summit will hopefully capture global headlines, a lot of preliminary work is happening every year in Bonn, the seat of the UNFCCC. To me, it really felt like that was where the real work of climate diplomacy was happening, with very little distraction in comparison to the COP. And this is where negotiators meet to talk about the technical details of the text that will hopefully be approved in November. And I say hopefully because it is not that easy, as we will hear in these interviews. So at SB62, I spoke with many experts who are at the heart of these negotiations, each of them bringing a unique perspective on what we can expect from Brazil's presidency and the challenges that lie ahead. In this episode, I'm bringing you the amazing Lina Asin from the International Institute for Environmental Development, who represents one of the most vulnerable groups in these negotiations, the least developed countries. Lina walked me through the critical work being done on adaptation finance and the global goal on adaptation, explaining why tripling adaptation finance by 2030 is not just a policy goal, but it is literally a matter of life and death for whole communities who are already facing climate disaster. I then spoke to Glindis Virginia Luciano from EIT Food, who shared her insight on how food systems, which are often overlooked in climate discussions, are now gaining traction as a sort of cross-cutting solutions. She also highlighted a concerning challenge that could undermine the entire COP30 process, whether developing country delegations will even have the funds to attend the summit in Brazil. Finally, I talked to Sanjay Vashid from Climate Action Network South Asia, who offered a very frank assessment of the Brazilian presidency approach, raising important questions about climate finance commitment and the true meaning of just transition, particularly the critical difference between asking rich nations to scale back their emissions versus expecting developing nations to abandon their development aspiration. So what emerged from this conversation is sort of a complex picture of hope and concern as we head towards what Brazil is calling the implementation COP in less than a month now. I really hope you enjoy it. Hello Lina, welcome to How Could We?
Hi, thanks for having me.
So can you please introduce yourself and tell me what you're doing here at SB62?
My name is Lina Yassin and I'm from Sudan. I'm a climate policy researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development, short for IIED. And I'm here to work and support the Least Developed Countries Group, the LDC Group, which is a group of 44 countries classified by the UN as the most poorest and most vulnerable to the climate change impacts. And Sudan, my home country, is one of those, is part of this group. So I'm here to work on providing technical support to ensure that whatever is negotiated here makes sense and is useful for the vulnerable communities in the LDCs.
Thank you. And so you are just coming out of negotiations. So can you tell us what agenda items are you following and how is it going?
So my focus is on adaptation, and then we mean how can countries adapt to the extreme climate events that they're facing. In Sudan, for example, we have floods every year where that results in extreme damage for certain parts of the country. So right here at the global level, we're discussing how can we provide support, not just financially, but also technically, so that countries know how to adapt and know who they can reach out to for support. And at this session in Bonn, there are 6 different agenda items, we call them, that are relevant for adaptation. So that's why I'm running from one room to another.
And so how is it going so far?
The biggest priority politically this year is something called the Global Goal on Adaptation. It is something that was established in 2015 in the Paris Agreement, and it was an attempt by developing countries to raise the profile of adaptation, because whenever we talk about climate change, we're mostly talking about mitigation, limiting greenhouse gases and emissions, but we never talk about the damage and the difficulties that countries go through already, even if we limit global warming today. So Global Goal on Adaptation was an attempt to raise the profile of adaptation, but we realize it is a very vague goal. It just says countries must reduce vulnerability and enhance their adaptive capacity. So for the past 10 years, we've been working to unpack what does that actually mean on reality, what does it mean in health, what does it mean in agriculture, and we've been able to get a framework for how this goal can work and be achieved 2 years ago. And right now we're working on developing indicators that helps us to measure the progress in those targets that we agreed 2 years ago. So that's the biggest priority right now, and it's something that could potentially be really, really good and really useful for countries to help them track their work and the progress, but also show the gaps and where needs are. And we're hoping that this can be finalized this year.
And is finance being discussed as part of the global goal on adaptation?
Yes, so we are discussing it in different ways. In this specific room, we don't talk about the amount of money, quantum, as they say here, but we talk about where money should be channeled. Because, for example, it's different when you say I've given 100 million just to adaptation than saying, oh, out of that 100 million, 90% of it went to specific adaptation projects on a topic, let's say health, but none of it went to water, for example. So what we're trying to do here is get a global assessment of which areas are underfunded and that are really critical for adaptation. For example, sometimes adaptation can be as simple as in Sudan when there was a flood 2019. As a result of that flood, there was a cholera outbreak in a village. And at the time, those people just needed a clinic because there was no clinic to help those impacted. So that, to us, is adaptation. But there's no way to make that argument if you can't have a target that says, yes, health and adaptation are linked and are important. So these are the type of things in which finance is a topic without really discussing numbers.
A lot of people don't know, but what's happening in Bonn is really laying the groundwork for what's going to happen in Belém, right? Is it going in the right direction for you?
What happens here will lay the groundwork and will actually determine already whether or not we're heading towards the right track. I think my general assessment of the first week is that usually negotiators and countries are more reserved in the first week, where they don't want to reveal all their cards and they are taking it slow. So my general assessment is it's been an okay first week. Things unravel quite quickly from next week, where we will see big developments, big text with brackets coming through, and this is where you will see maybe compromises. But from the global goal and adaptation side, and this is the key one, I think the conversations has been productive. Everyone does agree that this is an important task and a task that is big and needs attention. But if you ask me on Monday, it might be a different answer.
What do you feel are going to be the main challenge for the COP30 presidency? There is already a lot of expectation. They're talking a lot about implementation. The communication from the COP30 presidency is quite on point. They're quite good, but we also know that there are infrastructure challenge, a lot of different challenges.
Yeah, so I think everyone excited about Brazil being the presidency. They're an active party in this process and they know it. Another reason we are really excited about this COP is because Brazil has made it clear that adaptation is a priority for them. And usually adaptation is treated as a second priority or something that is trendy, but Brazil is trying to change that. It's trying to prove that if you want to talk about climate change, you have to always talk about adaptation. It's not a trendy topic that you can take on and off. In terms of challenges they might face, I think COP29 was not the best COP in terms of outcomes. A lot of us, especially least developed countries, walked out of it with a lot of bruises. Trust also was impacted. And Brazil has a lot to work through, and there's a big gap in the trust between developed and developing countries. And if that's not restored, multilateralism cannot work. So Brazil has to intensify its diplomatic efforts and try and start that dialogue between those two sides early, so that by the time we get to Brazil, we're able to trust each other and not be suspicious of any bridging proposals or ideas that come from one side or the other. It's not an easy task, but if there's any presidency that is ready to do it, I think it's Brazil.
And as you're saying, I think last year we realized that having the COP hosted by a country that isn't or wasn't historically involved in the negotiation makes it really, really hard, because they don't have this like climate diplomacy experience. And Brazil has been for many years, I don't know if it's always been, but for many, many years, very, very much involved with a large delegation, etc. Is there something that is happening here at SB62 that gives you hope for a breakthrough at COP30, or something that is gaining traction that people who are a little bit outside of this bubble should maybe know about or care about more?
One thing that we would love for people outside this process to know is that in 2021 in Glasgow, there was a really good outcome where developed countries agreed that adaptation finance right now is not enough, and they've pledged or committed to doubling their adaptation finance pledge by 2025. This pledge is expiring this year, and we know that doubling was great, but it was not enough. So one thing that the LDC group has already called for is renewal of this pledge and saying we doubled, let's triple. So tripling adaptation finance is something that we really think is essential, and we're hoping that Brazil could provide that space where we don't lose the momentum. And if we get that, it will mean a lot of difference. It would literally save lives somewhere. So it's a big thing for us.
And so when we're talking about tripling finance, we're talking about tripling public finance, right? Because there is a big discussion here also around the private finance, because the goal was 300 billion from governments, basically from nations, and then with the aim to get to 1.3 trillion, but with like blended finance, right? Yes. Can you tell us why is it so important that we have commitments from countries to put public finance on the table rather than hoping or encouraging private finance?
It's important for a lot of reasons. One of them is that those countries that need public financing are countries like my country who are already experiencing a huge amount of debt. We're still paying debt, and we're paying it against the dollar in our constantly depreciating local currency. So it's a cycle that we can't get out of. So public financing, specifically in terms of grants and highly concessional loans, means that our countries don't have to worry about paying back interest that they cannot survive, meaning that in 20 years we don't find ourselves stuck in even more debt. That's really important. The second thing is, yes, the 1.3 is a big amount, and being innovative, finding new sources of finance is key, and there is a big role that the private sector can play. But this conversation about the private sector needs to be approached with cautious. We need to start designing safeguards. Carbon markets were invented during the Kyoto Protocol, and even though it sounded like a wonderful idea on paper, a win-win for everyone, it did end up harming local communities and backfiring on a lot of developing countries. So whenever we talk about bringing in a new party and opening things up, we need to make sure there are safeguards so that communities, local communities specifically, are not hurt by the greed or the potential of profiting out of their resources or their struggles. Another point on this 1.3 trillion and something disappointing outcome is that we will not get this money, or this money is to be delivered by 2035. That's 10 years from now. That 10 years is going to mean 10 years of more damage, more extreme climate events, and more deaths and loss of livelihoods. And climate change won't wait. So we understand developed countries want us to wait for the money, but climate change won't wait, and disasters and lives will be lost. So another reason why we are calling for this tripling, because we want to bring the timeline forward. Tripled adaptation finance by 2030 so we can save lives and not regret by 2035 that we could have saved some communities but we didn't.
What if tackling climate change starts with rethinking who holds power? I'm Candace Lewis-Wilson, Senior Program Director at Center for Public Impact.
And I'm Gabrielle Barron, Senior Program Manager in the Climate Action Team at the Centre for Public Impact. We're the new hosts of Reimagining Government. In Season 4, we're exploring what happens when those too often excluded from decision-making lead the way.
Across 6 episodes, we'll spotlight leaders who are transforming how we respond to the climate crisis.
They're redesigning cities, challenging climate colonialism, defending the Amazon, mobilizing global activism, and bringing youth voices into politics and policy. At its heart, this season isn't about carbon emissions.
It's about power, who has it, how it's shared, and how reimagining leadership from the ground up can reshape the future of government for everyone. Subscribe and listen now, wherever you get your podcasts.
I loved this conversation with Lina because it really drove home how these seemingly abstract negotiations really translate into real-world impact, whether communities have access to basic healthcare during climate disaster or not, for instance. But her mention of the trust deficit between developed and developing countries got me thinking. If governments are struggling to work together, what role can other actors play in bridging these gaps, right? That's exactly what I wanted to explore with Glyndis Virginia Luciano from EIT Food. Hi Glyndis, welcome to How Could We podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So we're here at SB62 in Bonn, and we've been hearing a lot about the challenges that the presidency is going to have this year. So what do you think is going to be the main challenge for the COP presidency Brazil this year?
I think a big challenge is actually going to be, I know we've heard a lot about logistics, situations around that. We had a logistics meeting last week about this. And I mean, there's obviously concern on the housing situation, the costs in general. But I think something that we're not really talking about much yet, and that's going to affect the actual process of negotiations, is whether even country delegations from the global south will be able to make it and will be able to have the funds to actually attend. And so that's something that we really have to make sure that as civil society organizations, we're keeping not just in the back of our heads, but also at the forefront. So without country delegations being there, things cannot be negotiated. But I'm sure that with the efforts that the COP30 presidency is putting and wanting to make things affordable on the basis of what they've mentioned, that this is something that can be resolved. And I know that as civil society organizations, it's something that we're also going to kind of advocate and push for, that governments need to be funded to be able to negotiate the climate agenda. It's not a matter of if it's a necessary thing, it's a must.
Exactly. And so the presidency is really talking about its intent to bring in the civil society and non-state actors as well. They're talking about the mutirao. So each presidency, they bring something from their culture. That's what the Brazil presidency is bringing. How do you think this mutirao effort is shaping or influencing the negotiation already, or what's happening here on what do we see coming up for COP30?
I know that since in the beginning, there was this idea that this was supposed to be the people's COP, the implementation COP, the food COP. Clearly, there's a lot of expectations, for COP30. I do agree that the presidency, it's clear that they want to make sure that there's all non-state actors are present, that they are creating spaces in which discussions can be had, whether that's with civil society, with private sector, with other governments, of course. It's something that we're going to have to wait and see, and it's quite early to tell on how that's actually going to happen. As we know, there is a lot of concern in general on the cost of civil society being able to attend COP. And so how can we have communal collective action if there's going to be an issue with access?
Exactly. They talk a lot about it, but we're going to have to see how it looks like in practice. What's one thing that is happening here at SB62 which gives you genuine hope for a breakthrough at COP30?
It's so interesting you asked that question, because there's a lot of doom and gloom. You feel it, the fragility of the systems that are supposed to be upholding these dialogues and conversations, and systems are crumbling with the different issues that are happening around the world as well. And so I think, though, that what does give me hope is that as systems are crumbling, of course, as civil society, we do have the opportunity to step in, to bring forth solutions that can be scalable from our communities, that can be economically feasible. And so I think that this is, if anything, a prime time to be able to do that work, to step in and support governments as well, to bring farmers to the table, young people, women, youth, and private sector, to be able to provide the frameworks that are needed as well to private sector. And so being able to, as civil society, to step in and kind of guide those conversations where we can and provide those frameworks when we can is actually an opportunity and something that does give me hope.
Brazil wants it to be the COP of implementation. What's one shift that you think we need to see at COP30 for accelerated climate progress?
Ownership in every sense of the word. Ownership from all of the different constituencies, from governments, from private sector, and also from civil society. I think we're also at a point where we have to push the agenda forward, of course, and bring those practical solutions that can be implementable, that already work. There's so many things that already work out there. And so it's a matter of bringing those to the forefront and doing it consistently and not losing momentum. We have to become resourceful on how we do that and identify who the champions are, who can be our allies in being able to bring those scalable solutions to the forefront and actually have them implemented as well.
Is there something that is gaining traction here in Bonn and that people don't really know about outside of this bubble that we're in?
Oftentimes I work in food and agriculture. It's not a topic that, let's say, it's not necessarily very sexy, but I think something that we're starting to see is that food and agriculture for the past couple of years has been gaining traction. And while we were, expecting for COP30 to be a food COP, and it doesn't seem so far that that's going to be the case. And so as a community, our goal will really, specifically the food systems community, our goal should really be to continue to bring food and agriculture as the cross-cutting theme that it is. We're going to have the Action on Food Hub, which is where a space we convene non-state actors in the Blue Zone, where we directly connect the negotiation process to real-world things that are happening, solutions that are taking place in communities, and just bringing that into the COPs, where it's necessary to bridge the world of what happens in global negotiation processes and what happens on the ground. And so this is my invitation for those that are interested to join us, as food is at the center of it all.
What struck me most about my discussion with Glindis was her honest assessment of the fragility of the systems we're relying on, and yet her optimism about civil society stepping up to fill the gaps. But I wanted to dig deeper into some of the tensions she touched upon, especially around whether this Brazilian presidency is as transformative as it's being portrayed. For that, I turned to someone who's been watching these processes with a critical eye for years, Sanjay Vashit from Climate Action Network's South Asia. Hello Sanjay, welcome to How Could We podcast.
Hi, good morning from Bonn.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Sanjay Vashist. I'm Director of Climate Action Network South Asia, and I'm also Senior Expert to Switch Asia program in Asia and Pacific.
So what particular agenda item are you following here in Bonn at the SB62, and what are your hope or expectations on that matter?
Well, I follow a big picture. So basically, most of the agenda items I keep in mind, but very deep, just transition is one among them, and loss and damage.
What are your expectations for those agenda?
Just transition is now unpacking slowly, which is much bigger than energy transition. Everyone is visualizing transition, how it may look like, but that may not be the case. It will change for sure. It's the communities who will decide what kind of change they want to embrace. So in these negotiations, I'm hoping to bring more clarity, exchange notes on transition. Loss and damage, we are still waiting for funds to arrive in FRLD, which is unfortunate. And global adaptation, 499 indicators, too much to handle. I think we need more efficient indicators so that we can monitor and frame global adaptation.
What do you think is gaining traction here in Bonn that most people don't really know about?
One is just transition, how justice will come, and the second is sustainable consumption and production. We have been hearing about lifestyle, sustainable lifestyle, as one key ingredient to bring greenhouse gas emissions low. But countries have not been able to bring it because this requires a lot of sacrifice. Basically, people need to come out of their comfort zone. So sustainable consumption and production and circular economy is picking up, and we do hope that this time ambition from greenhouse gas emission reduction is primarily from SCP, because that is more permanent, and that will also drive transition on ground.
And so you just had an event, a press conference here, and someone asked about degrowth. And I think one thing that we have to be very careful in these halls and at the COP is to make sure that, we don't adopt the same narrative for the rich country than for the poor countries. And that's what you were explaining to the person who just asked the question. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, I think one of the expectation is that we stop growing, no more growth at all, which would be unfair and which will not be justice for people in developing countries. They've just started making some gains on development agenda. Degrowth would mean 300 million people in India remain below poverty line. People remain without home. So I think degrowth is not a solution. Deconstruct wasteful infrastructure, and then decouple energy-intensive practices or emission-intensive practices or resource-intensive practices and move towards sustainable alternatives is the solution now, and that we need to work on. And that's what I was trying to explain, that the good blend would be deconstruct and decouple and make sure that the new approach of sustainable consumption and production and circularity ensures that people's aspirations are met. If people's aspirations are not met, even in developed countries and developing countries, I don't think we'll be able to have humanity with the kind of expectations they have from their life. So way of life need to change. Way of life need to align more with environment sustainability rather than economic sustainability.
And so we're talking here about people's aspiration, and presidency is trying to bring the Mutirao spirit into this COP, and that means basically having community, collective efforts to solve climate change. How do you think this is shaping or influencing the negotiation, or is it?
I'm a bit disappointed from Brazilian incoming presidency, primarily because they're not talking about climate finance. They're avoiding that. They are allowing private sector to step in. Basically, they are giving gateway to developed countries who are binded by historic responsibility and politics-based principle. They are trying to set goals which are very less ambitious. That would ensure success of Brazil COP, that's fine, but that will not ensure progress on agenda.
So what do you think is the main challenge for this presidency this year?
How to ensure progress on climate finance, 300 billion, how to move higher, at least closer to 1.3 trillion. That's what civil society has been asking. And that's one. And of course, bring more clarity on just transition. But you have to make efforts to make sure that there are more climate finance amount available, being committed by developed countries, and there's more clarity on justice aspect of transition.
As you can see, there are a lot of remaining questions about COP30, and we've discussed many themes in this episode and the previous one with other experts I interviewed during the SB here in Bonn. This conversation reminds us that climate negotiations are fundamentally about justice and equity. The challenge isn't just reducing emission, it's doing so in a way that doesn't leave behind the very people who have contributed the least to the problem, but suffer the most from its consequences. As we head towards COP30, Brazil has positioned itself as ready to bridge divides and to deliver on implementation. But as our guests made clear, its success will require much more than diplomatic skills. It will require unprecedented financial commitment, genuine inclusion of civil society, and obviously a willingness to confront the hard truth about what justice really means in a warming world. The technical negotiations happening in Bonn might seem far removed from daily life, but they're setting the stage for decisions that will affect every community on Earth. So again, thank you so much for joining us on How Could We? If this episode sparked your interest in climate negotiation, I really encourage you to follow the development from COP30. Thank you for joining us on How Could We? And if this episode sparked your interest in climate negotiation, I encourage you to follow the developments from COP30. And in the show notes, you will find a link to a form that you can subscribe to if you're interested in subscribing to our COP30 mailing list. And if you are, you will receive daily information during COP about what Climate-KIC is doing there and how the negotiations are going. Thanks again for listening.